The quiet hero. Marcus Bennett was a man of honor, someone who dedicated his life to serving others. To his friends and family, he was a respected figure, a steadfast presence in the community with an unwavering sense of justice. But to the people who didn't know him, Marcus was just another face, a tall black man with a quiet confidence, often mistaken for someone far less remarkable than he was. As a high-ranking investigator with federal authority, Marcus had built a career on uncovering corruption, fighting against discrimination, and defending the vulnerable. His accomplishments were vast, yet he wore them lightly, preferring humility over recognition. On a cool autumn afternoon, Marcus found himself in a small-town convenience store during a trip to visit an old friend. He'd stopped in to grab a few essentials, a bottle of water, a pack of gum, and a couple of snacks. It was the sort of place that hadn't changed in years, with creaky floors, shelves stocked with dusty canned goods, and a cashier who greeted every customer by name. Marcus had spent years working in cities across the country, so he found a certain comfort in the familiarity of small towns. People knew each other, looked out for one another, and the pace of life was slower. But as Marcus made his way through the aisles, he noticed an unsettling gaze following him. Standing near the entrance was a police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, his expression hard and unwelcoming. The officer's eyes were locked onto Marcus, studying him with an intensity that felt out of place. Marcus was used to scrutiny in his line of work, but there was something different about this look, a simmering hostility that spoke of prejudice rather than suspicion. Ignoring the officer's glare, Marcus continued his shopping, choosing to take the high road. He'd dealt with people like this before, people who judged others by the color of their skin rather than their character. Years of experience had taught him how to remain calm, how to let insults and stares slide off his back. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was about to escalate. As he approached the checkout counter, the officer stepped into his path, blocking his way. Marcus looked up, meeting the man's gaze with a calm yet questioning expression. "Something wrong, officer?" he asked, his tone polite yet firm. The officer's eyes narrowed. "You look out of place," he said, his voice dripping with thinly veiled hostility. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised by the bluntness. "Just picking up a few things. Is that a problem?" The officer crossed his arms, his stance rigid and confrontational. "We've had a few issues in this area lately. Strangers coming in, causing trouble. Just making sure you're not one of them." Marcus could feel the eyes of the cashier and a few other customers on him. The air was thick with tension, and he knew he had a choice. He could reveal his position, his authority, and watch this officer back down in an instant, or he could let this play out, give the man enough rope to reveal his true nature. Marcus decided on the latter, choosing to remain silent about his identity. Sometimes, the best way to expose someone's biases was to let them act on them. "I'm just here to buy a few things, officer." "Nothing more," Marcus replied calmly, keeping his expression neutral. But the officer wasn't satisfied. He leaned in closer, his gaze growing more intense. "You're acting suspicious. Might have to take you outside for some questions." Marcus glanced around, noting the discomfort on the faces of the onlookers. The cashier shifted nervously, clearly unsure of whether to intervene. Marcus knew that the officer was trying to assert dominance, to make him feel small and intimidated. But Marcus had faced far more powerful people in far worse situations. This officer's attempt at intimidation was almost laughable to him. Still, he played along, nodding slowly. "If you feel that's necessary, officer," he said, a hint of steel in his voice. The officer led Marcus outside, his hand resting on the baton at his side, as if ready to escalate the situation at a moment's notice. Once they were out of earshot from the others, he turned to Marcus, his posture aggressive, and his eyes filled with disdain. "Why don't you tell me where you're from?" he demanded, his tone dripping with suspicion. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "I'm here visiting a friend. Just passing through." The officer scoffed, shaking his head. People like you always have some excuse. You think you can just walk in here, do as you please. Marcus felt a flicker of anger rise within him, but he kept it under control. He knew that men like this officer thrived on provoking reactions, on using their authority to make others feel powerless. He wouldn't give him that satisfaction. I'm not here to cause any trouble, officer. Just buying a few things and minding my business, Marcus said, keeping his tone steady. The officer's expression twisted into a sneer. I don't believe you. You think just because you've got a clean shirt and some fancy words, you're different. I know your type. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of discrimination settle over him. He'd seen this kind of hatred countless times, but it never got easier. Yet he remained silent, allowing the officer to continue his tirade. He wanted to see just how far this man would go, how deep his prejudice ran. By now, a small crowd had gathered near the entrance of the store, watching the confrontation unfold. Some whispered to each other, while others pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Marcus could see the worry and discomfort on their faces, but he also saw something else: curiosity, a desire to see justice served. As the officer's accusations grew louder, Marcus felt a sense of calm settle over him. He knew that the truth would soon come to light, that this officer's arrogance and prejudice would be his undoing. All right, the officer said, his voice filled with authority. I'm detaining you for suspicious behavior. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Marcus complied, feeling the cold steel of handcuffs click around his wrists. The officer patted him down roughly, searching his pockets and finding nothing but a wallet and a set of car keys. His frustration was palpable as he continued the search, hoping to uncover some justification for his actions. When he pulled out Marcus's wallet and found his ID, he froze, staring at it in disbelief. The crowd grew silent, sensing the shift in the air as the officer's face went pale. Staring back at him was the identification card of a high-ranking federal investigator, someone with far more authority than he could ever hope to possess. Marcus met the officer's gaze, a calm but stern expression on his face. Surprised, officer. The officer stammered, his arrogance crumbling as he struggled to find his words. I didn't realize. Marcus nodded, his voice cold and measured. You didn't realize because you assumed. You judged me by my appearance, and you thought you had the right to treat me with disrespect. But you were wrong. The officer's face flushed with shame as he took a step back, the realization of his mistake settling over him. The crowd watched in stunned silence, recording every word, every movement, ensuring that this moment would not be forgotten. Marcus continued, his voice filled with quiet authority. This is what happens when prejudice blinds you, officer. I've spent my life fighting against people who abuse their power, and today you've given me a first-hand reminder of why that fight is necessary. The officer opened his mouth to apologize, but Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. Your apology means nothing. Actions like yours can ruin lives, destroy communities. It's time for people like you to be held accountable. The crowd murmured in agreement, their support a powerful reminder of the impact one moment of courage could have. Marcus knew that this was only the beginning. He would ensure that this officer faced the consequences of his actions, and he would work to bring change to a system that allowed prejudice to thrive. As he walked away, his head held high and his wrists now free, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would not be silenced, and he would not stand by while others suffered from the same injustices he had faced. This was his fight, and he was ready to see it through to the end. The confrontation and a call for justice. The shock of the moment settled over the crowd like a heavy fog. As Marcus walked back toward the store, the murmurs grew louder, whispers of admiration, disbelief, and anger mixing together. People who had watched the scene unfold pulled out their phones to capture the final moments, snapping photos and recording videos, ensuring that this encounter would not be swept under the rug or easily forgotten. The officer, still standing outside, seemed frozen in place, grappling with the enormity of his mistake. His arrogance had vanished, replaced by a pallor that reflected his regret. Marcus glanced back at him briefly, his expression unreadable. He had encountered men like this officer many times throughout his career, individuals whose authority was intertwined with prejudice, who wielded their power as a weapon rather than a tool for justice. This was the very behavior Marcus had dedicated his life to fighting against. As Marcus re-entered the store, he saw a few familiar faces, residents who had seen him in the area before, some who had even shared brief conversations with him over the years. They looked at him with a mixture of respect and solidarity, understanding that this incident was not an isolated event, but a reflection of deeper issues within their town. The store manager, a man named Greg, approached Marcus hesitantly. Greg was in his mid-40s, with a kind face that usually wore a welcoming smile. Today, however, his expression was troubled. "Mr. Bennett, I'm so sorry you had to go through that," Greg said, his voice filled with genuine regret. "We don't stand for that kind of behavior here. You're always welcome in our store and in our community." Marcus offered a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Greg. I know this town has good people, people who care about justice and fairness. Unfortunately, there are always those who let their biases cloud their judgment. But that's why we're here, to hold them accountable." Greg nodded, glancing out the window at the officer, who had finally begun to walk away, his shoulders slumped with shame. "Do you think he'll face any consequences for what he did?" he asked, his tone tentative. Marcus's eyes hardened slightly, the resolve in his gaze unmistakable. "He will," he replied firmly, "not just because of what he did to me, but because of what his actions represent. No one should be treated that way, regardless of their background, status, or the color of their skin. I'll make sure he faces the consequences of his actions, not just for today, but to prevent this from happening again." The customers and employees who had gathered around nodded in agreement. The incident had stirred something within them, a shared recognition that they had witnessed an injustice, one that they couldn't ignore. Marcus's calm, dignified response had resonated deeply, sparking a collective desire for change. As he made his way out of the store, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He knew this was more than just a personal affront. It was an opportunity to address a larger issue, to challenge the systemic prejudice that had allowed this officer to feel entitled to his treatment. His mind raced with thoughts of how to proceed, how to ensure that this incident would be more than a passing outrage. Back in his car, Marcus pulled out his phone and began making calls. His first call was to his close friend and legal advisor, Claire Thompson. Claire was a fierce advocate for justice, a civil rights attorney who had spent years battling against discriminatory practices. She was someone Marcus trusted implicitly, someone who understood the complexities of cases like this and the importance of taking a stand. "Marcus, what's going on?" Claire's voice crackled over the speaker, her tone both warm and concerned. Marcus recounted the incident, his voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. Claire listened without interrupting, her silence conveying both shock and determination. "Marcus," she said after a moment, her voice hardening with resolve, "this is unacceptable. We can't let him get away with this. I'll help you file a formal complaint. We'll involve the community, and we'll make sure this officer's actions are brought to light." "That's exactly what I was thinking," Marcus replied, relief washing over him. "But I don't just want this to be about him. This is bigger than one officer. This is about the culture that allows people like him to think they can act with impunity. We need to bring in accountability measures, training programs, something to ensure that the entire department understands what justice really means." Claire's voice softened, a hint of pride evident in her tone. "I knew you'd say that. Always thinking of the bigger picture, aren't you? I'll start gathering resources and contacts. Let's make this a turning point, not just for you, but for everyone in this town." They discussed their strategy for the next hour, brainstorming ways to involve the community, to educate and empower them to stand up against injustices. they would organize a community forum, inviting residents to share their own experiences, to bring forward any other instances of discrimination they had witnessed or endured. Marcus wanted the people of this town to know that they were not alone, that there was strength in unity. Later that day, Marcus drove to the local community center, where he planned to speak with the center's director about hosting the forum. The center was a gathering place for people of all backgrounds, a hub of activity, education, and fellowship. As he entered, he was greeted by familiar faces, people who knew him not just as an authority figure, but as a friend and ally. The director, Mrs. Eunice Hayes, was an elderly woman with a vibrant personality and a fierce sense of justice. She had known Marcus for years, often inviting him to speak to the youth about leadership and resilience. When he explained his idea to host a community forum to address the recent incident, her eyes lit up with determination. "Marcus, you've always been a force for good in this town. If anyone can bring about change, it's you," Mrs. Hayes said, reaching out to clasp his hand. "You have my full support. Let's get the word out. Let's make this forum a place where people feel safe to share their stories, to stand together against discrimination." Over the next few days, word spread rapidly. Flyers were posted around town, social media buzzed with posts about the upcoming forum, and local activists rallied to spread the message. People shared their anticipation, their hope that this would be a moment of reckoning, a chance to confront a system that had allowed prejudice to fester unchecked. On the day of the forum, the community center was filled to capacity. People of all ages, races, and backgrounds came together, their faces a mixture of apprehension and determination. Marcus stood at the front of the room, feeling a swell of gratitude for the support of his friends, family, and the community at large. He took a deep breath, scanning the faces of those who had come to stand with him, to stand for justice. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady and filled with purpose. "What happened to me wasn't just about one man's actions. It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that affects us all. Today, we are here to make sure that prejudice and discrimination have no place in our town, that we hold those in power accountable for their actions." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers filling the room with an energy that was both empowering and humbling. As Marcus continued to speak, sharing his vision for a fairer, more just community, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just a moment of personal justice. It was a movement, a call for change that would ripple through the town and beyond. One by one, people came forward to share their own stories of discrimination, of encounters with prejudice that had left them feeling powerless and marginalized. Some spoke of similar incidents with law enforcement, while others shared experiences from workplaces, schools, and public spaces. Each story was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the resilience of those who had endured injustice and refused to be silenced. As the forum continued, Marcus felt a powerful shift in the air, a sense of unity, of collective resolve. The community was no longer willing to accept the status quo. They had been awakened, emboldened by Marcus's example and by the stories of their friends and neighbors. By the end of the night, the crowd left the community center with a shared commitment to stand against injustice, to hold each other accountable, and to work toward a future where respect and fairness were more than just ideals. They were the foundation of their society. Marcus left that night knowing that his fight was just beginning, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. With the support of his community and the strength of his convictions, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, determined to turn this moment into a lasting change. The ripple effect. The forum had left an indelible impact on the community. In the days following, discussions of equality, justice, and accountability echoed throughout the town. Conversations about the treatment of Marcus by the officer were held in living rooms, at workplace lunch tables, and even among students in local schools. People who had once been silent on issues of prejudice were now finding the courage to speak up, emboldened by Marcus's example and the unity displayed at the forum. Marcus was both gratified and exhausted. His goal had never been personal recognition, but rather a call to action, a way to show the people of this town that standing up to prejudice was possible and necessary. The forum had proven that they were ready to take that stand. But he knew that real change required more than just words. It required structural transformation. And so, Marcus resolved to keep pushing forward. On the Monday after the forum, Marcus made his way to the police station. He had a meeting with the town's police chief, Captain Robert Langston, a man known for his strong-willed nature and, at times, his resistance to change. Captain Langston had maintained a reputation as an old-school law enforcement officer, a man who believed in traditional methods and had little patience for what he considered unnecessary reforms. Marcus knew that getting through to him would be a challenge. As Marcus stepped into the sterile, fluorescent-lit precinct, officers glanced up, some with curiosity, others with wary recognition. The events of last week had spread quickly, and many of them knew exactly who Marcus was. A few exchanged whispers, their expressions ranging from admiration to discomfort. Marcus paid them no mind. He was here with a purpose. Captain Langston's office was at the end of a narrow hallway lined with old plaques and commendations, mementos of the precinct's past accomplishments. Marcus knocked on the door, and a gruff voice called him in. The office was cluttered with stacks of paperwork and an array of old awards, each gathering dust in the corner. Captain Langston, a man in his early 60s with graying hair and a steely gaze, sat behind his desk, hands folded and jaw set. "Mr. Bennett," Langston greeted him, his voice carrying a note of begrudging respect. "Take a seat." Marcus sat down, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the captain's intense stare. "Thank you for meeting with me, Captain Langston." The captain leaned back, studying Marcus for a moment. "I've heard quite a bit about you over the last week. Seems you've stirred up quite a reaction in our little town." Marcus nodded, unflinching. "That was the idea. I wanted people to know what happened, but more importantly, I wanted them to know that it's not an isolated incident. This isn't just about one officer. It's about creating an environment where prejudice and discrimination can't thrive." Langston's face remained impassive. "Look, Marcus, I understand your perspective. I truly do. But law enforcement is a tough job. My officers are out there every day, risking their lives, dealing with difficult situations. Sometimes judgments are made in the heat of the moment." Marcus leaned forward, meeting the captain's gaze squarely. "Captain, I respect the work your officers do. I've dedicated my life to justice, just like you. But there's a difference between making a tough call and acting on prejudice. When one of your officers judged me based solely on the color of my skin, that wasn't a judgment call. That was racial profiling, plain and simple." Captain Langston shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping on the desk. "So what exactly are you proposing?" "Sensitivity training. More workshops on diversity." Marcus nodded. "Yes, but it's more than that. I'm proposing a complete overhaul of the way officers interact with the community. We need accountability measures, regular evaluations on racial bias, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. I've already spoken to several members of the town council, and they're in full support of these changes." The captain's brows furrowed. "You're asking for a lot, Marcus. Changing protocols, training programs. These things take time and resources." Marcus's expression remained resolute. "I understand, but these changes are essential. If we want the community to trust law enforcement, we have to earn that trust. People need to know that they'll be treated fairly, that their voices will be heard. Ignoring this issue won't make it go away. It'll only deepen the divide." Captain Langston was silent for a moment, his gaze thoughtful as he considered Marcus's words. The tension in the room was palpable, each man firmly rooted in his stance. Finally, Langston spoke, his voice carrying a reluctant concession. "All right, Marcus. I'll agree to discuss these measures with the department heads. I can't make any promises yet, but I'll consider your proposal." Marcus knew this was only a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. He extended his hand, offering a nod of gratitude. "Thank you, "Captain, that's all I ask, for now." As he left the precinct, Marcus felt a mixture of hope and determination. There was still a long road ahead, but at least now he had a foothold. The captain's tentative agreement meant that the conversation was far from over. Part 4. A Community United. Back in town, the momentum continued to build. Inspired by Marcus's courage, more people began to come forward with their own stories of discrimination and prejudice. Local activists, faith leaders, and business owners rallied together, organizing meetings and workshops aimed at fostering understanding and equality. Even students from the local high school formed a group dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion, holding after-school discussions and bringing in speakers to share their experiences. One evening, Marcus was invited to speak at a town hall meeting organized by the community. The meeting was held in the largest space available, an old theater that had been refurbished for community events. The turnout was overwhelming. People from all walks of life packed the seats, their faces filled with anticipation and solidarity. As Marcus stood at the podium, he took a moment to look around the room, moved by the sight of so many people coming together for a shared cause. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of conviction as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. "This isn't just about what happened to me. This is about every person who has ever felt the sting of prejudice, who has been made to feel like they don't belong. Today, we're taking a stand together to say that discrimination has no place in our town or anywhere else." The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of support that washed over him like a tide. He continued, sharing his vision for a future where respect and equality were the foundation of their community, where law enforcement served as protectors, not oppressors. As Marcus spoke, the atmosphere in the room grew charged with a sense of purpose, of collective resolve. People nodded in agreement, exchanged glances of encouragement, and even shed a few tears as they felt the weight of the moment. They were not just witnesses to a speech, they were participants in a movement. After his speech, people lined up to speak with Marcus, sharing their own experiences, expressing gratitude, and offering their support. One young man, a high school student named Jamal, approached him with wide eyes and a hesitant smile. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice filled with admiration, "I just want you to know, what you're doing means a lot. I've dealt with stuff like this too. People assuming things about me just because of how I look. Seeing you stand up, it makes me believe I can too." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You can, Jamal. And remember, you're not alone. We're all in this together. Don't ever let anyone make you feel less than you are." As the evening wore on, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had come to this town simply to visit an old friend, but now he found himself at the heart of a community's transformation. The people here had shown resilience, courage, and an unbreakable determination to fight for what was right. The officers' reckoning. The town's push for reform reverberated beyond its borders. News outlets began picking up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about prejudice in law enforcement and the power of community unity. The forum and Marcus's town hall speech had gone viral, sparking debates online, with thousands sharing stories of similar experiences. This quiet town was now a symbol of resistance against injustice, and Marcus Bennett had become its reluctant hero. Within the precinct, however, the atmosphere was tense. Officers and staff felt the pressure mounting. The scrutiny of the public, the whispers among themselves about what would happen to Officer Bradley, the officer who had unjustly detained Marcus. Some were defensive, claiming that Bradley was simply doing his job, while others privately admitted that his actions had crossed a line. Captain Langston, aware of the growing tension, knew he couldn't ignore the situation any longer. He'd already agreed to work with Marcus on reform, but there was unfinished business concerning Bradley's conduct. One afternoon, Captain Langston called Bradley into his office. The officer walked in, his demeanor a mix of defensiveness and arrogance. He was a tall, imposing man with a military haircut and a permanent scowl etched into his face. Bradley's approach to policing had always been rooted in authority over empathy, and the recent incident with Marcus had brought his attitude to light in a way he hadn't expected. "Officer Bradley, sit down," Langston said, his voice curt. Bradley complied, his expression wary. "Yes, sir." Langston leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I think you know why you're here." Bradley shrugged, his tone dismissive. "I was doing my job, Captain. I had reason to believe he was suspicious." "You know how it is." Langston held up a hand, silencing him. "I don't want to hear excuses, Bradley. This isn't about doing your job. This is about crossing a line. You detained an innocent man based solely on prejudice, and it just so happened that the man you targeted is someone with more influence and authority than you can imagine." Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing with anger. "So what? Just because he has some fancy title, he's above the law?" Langston's eyes narrowed. "No, Bradley, this isn't about titles. It's about respect. It's about the fact that you judged him based on his appearance, and in doing so, you failed in your duty as a law enforcement officer. And now, the entire town is calling for accountability." Bradley's anger simmered, but he remained silent, sensing that his usual bravado would get him nowhere here. Langston continued, his voice low but firm. "You've put this entire department under scrutiny, Bradley. Our reputation, our trust within the community. Everything is at stake because of your actions. And as your superior, I can't turn a blind eye to this." Bradley swallowed, his confidence visibly shaken. "So, what happens now?" "You'll be placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation," Langston said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If the investigation confirms that your actions were rooted in prejudice, there will be consequences. I suggest you take this time to reflect on your behavior, Bradley. This is not the kind of department I intend to run." Bradley's face turned red with frustration, but he managed to nod. "Understood, Captain." As he left Langston's office, Bradley's mind swirled with anger and resentment. He couldn't believe that his career was now hanging by a thread, all because of one man who had the gall to challenge his authority. And yet, deep down, he felt a gnawing discomfort, a faint awareness that perhaps he had indeed crossed a line, that his actions had been driven more by his own biases than by genuine suspicion. But he wasn't ready to admit that yet. The community's resolve. Meanwhile, Marcus continued working with Claire and local activists to solidify the reforms they had discussed. They held workshops, educating the community on their rights when dealing with law enforcement, and offering training sessions on recognizing and combating racial profiling. The energy in the town was palpable, a collective determination to transform the pain of discrimination into meaningful change. At one workshop, Marcus noticed a familiar face in the crowd. Jamal, the high school student who had spoken to him at the forum. Jamal was seated in the front row, listening intently as Marcus and Claire spoke about the importance of standing up against prejudice. After the workshop ended, Jamal approached Marcus, his eyes filled with a newfound confidence. "Mr. Bennett, I just wanted to thank you again," Jamal said. "I've been coming to all the meetings and workshops, and it's changed how I see things. I used to feel like I couldn't say anything, like I just had to put up with how people treated me. But now, I know I don't have to stay silent." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. "That's exactly why we're doing this, Jamal. Change starts with each of us recognizing our own worth, our own power, and you're a part of that change." As the days passed, more young people like Jamal joined the movement, inspired by Marcus's example and eager to be part of a new chapter for their town. They organized rallies, held community discussions, and even set up a hotline where residents could report incidents of discrimination or misconduct. The community was no longer willing to be passive. They had become a force for accountability and justice. A meeting with the officer. One evening, Marcus received a phone call from Captain Langston. The captain sounded uncharacteristically somber, his tone carrying an edge of hesitation. "Marcus," Langston began, "I know you have every reason to refuse this, but Officer Bradley has requested to speak with you. He says he wants to apologize. I leave the decision up to you." Marcus was taken aback. He hadn't expected Bradley to seek him out, especially after the backlash he had faced. Part of him wanted to refuse, to deny Bradley the chance to ease his conscience. But another part of him, the part that had always believed in redemption, in the possibility of change, knew that this conversation might be necessary, not just for Bradley, but for the town. "All right," Marcus said finally. "I'll meet with him." The meeting was set for the following day in a neutral space, a quiet room at the community center where they could speak privately. When Marcus arrived, he found Bradley already seated, his posture tense, his gaze fixed on the floor. Gone was the arrogance and bravado that had defined their previous encounter. In its place was a man grappling with the consequences of his actions. Marcus took a seat across from him, his expression calm but guarded. For a few moments, they sat in silence, the weight of the past weeks hanging between them. Finally, Bradley looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and shame. "Mr. Bennett, I owe you an apology," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I was wrong. I let my own biases get in the way of my duty. I made assumptions about you that had no basis, and I know that I disrespected you. I'm sorry." Marcus regarded him carefully, his gaze unwavering. "Do you understand why what you did was wrong, Officer Bradley? This isn't just about me. It's about the way you see people, the way you allow your biases to affect your actions. This isn't the first time someone like me has been treated this way by someone like you." A new chapter for the community. In the weeks that followed, the town continued to evolve, transforming from a place defined by unspoken prejudices to one marked by openness, dialogue, and a renewed sense of community. Marcus watched with pride and cautious optimism as new initiatives sprang up, fueled by the momentum sparked by his own encounter and the town's powerful response. The changes weren't superficial. They reached into every corner of the community. Under pressure from local activists and Marcus's unwavering commitment, the police department initiated new training programs that emphasized de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and active listening. Officers were required to attend monthly workshops where they engaged in role-playing exercises to better understand the impact of racial profiling and how their actions could influence the lives of those they served. Marcus attended one of these workshops to observe, sitting quietly in the back as officers shared their reflections and discussed their struggles in adapting to the new protocols. Some officers admitted that they hadn't initially taken the sessions seriously, viewing them as bureaucratic impositions. But over time, many had come to appreciate the lessons, realizing the blind spots they carried and the biases that had influenced their behavior. Officer Bradley was among them. No longer the arrogant man Marcus had encountered in the convenience store, Bradley had become one of the most engaged participants in the workshops. He asked questions, volunteered to role-play scenarios, and even shared his own story of the day he'd wrongly detained Marcus. His vulnerability, his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes in front of his colleagues, had a ripple effect throughout the department. One evening, after a particularly impactful session, Bradley approached Marcus as he was leaving the community center. He looked different, less rigid, more grounded, as if the weight he'd been carrying had finally been lifted. "Mr. Bennett," Bradley began, his voice steady and sincere, "I just wanted to thank you. Not just for the chance you gave me, but for everything you've done for this town. I used to think I knew everything there was to know about being a cop. But you taught me that being a good officer is about more than enforcing the law. It's about respecting the people you serve." Marcus nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you, Officer Bradley. It takes courage to face yourself, to admit when you're wrong and work to make things right. That's the kind of integrity this town needs. Keep going. Change isn't easy, but you're on the right path." Bradley looked down, visibly moved by Marcus's words. "I will, sir. I promise." The community festival. As summer approached, the town decided to host a community festival to celebrate their progress and unity. People poured in from neighboring towns, eager to join in the festivities and see for themselves the community that had captured the attention of the region. Local vendors set up stalls selling handmade crafts, homemade food, and art that represented the diverse cultures within the town. The festival was more than just an event. It was a symbol of the town's resilience, its commitment to growth, and its newfound identity as a place where everyone was welcome. Marcus had been asked to give a speech, and as he stood on the stage overlooking the crowd, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice carrying across the open-air venue. "What we're celebrating today isn't just the changes we've made as a community, but the strength it took to make those changes happen. We faced hard truths, acknowledged mistakes, and chose to build something better together." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the town square. Marcus continued, sharing stories of the people he'd met, the conversations that had inspired him, and the bravery he'd witnessed among the town's residents. As he spoke, he saw familiar faces nodding, their expressions filled with pride and a sense of ownership in the progress they had achieved together. One of those faces belonged to Jamal, the high school student who had confided in Marcus weeks ago. Jamal stood at the front, beaming with pride. Next to him was his mother, who had come to every workshop and meeting, encouraging her son to stand up for what he believed in. Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of joy, knowing that the younger generation was already embracing the values of respect and equality that he had fought so hard to bring to the town. When Marcus finished his speech, Jamal took the stage to present him with a plaque on behalf of the town, a symbol of gratitude and respect. Jamal's voice shook with emotion as he spoke.